Before you abandon your spiritual journey forever, let me share what happened to Joel Goldsmith in that quiet hotel room in 1928. He was dying from tuberculosis. Doctors had given up completely, and his faith was utterly shattered. But in that moment of complete surrender and hopelessness, something extraordinary occurred that changed everything he believed about God, healing, and the very nature of reality itself. What Joel discovered wasn't another prayer technique, positive thinking method, or spiritual practice to add to his collection. It was a fundamental shift in consciousness that instantly transformed his dying body into perfect health. This wasn't gradual improvement over months or years. Within just a few hours, his lungs were completely clear, his fever was gone, and his life was totally restored through pure spiritual realization. The secret Joel uncovered that night became the foundation for thousands of documented healings worldwide over the next 4 decades. Students who learned this principle experienced miraculous recoveries from terminal illnesses, financial disasters, and broken relationships. But here's what makes this different from everything else you've tried before in your spiritual search and study. This wasn't another technique to practice or method to master. It was recognition of what had always been true, but hidden from ordinary human perception. Joel realized that every prayer, affirmation, and spiritual technique he had learned was actually working against him by reinforcing the very separation it claimed to heal. Joel realized that every prayer, affirmation, and spiritual technique he had learned was actually working against him in the most fundamental way. He discovered that trying to change conditions through spiritual effort was the very thing blocking his healing and keeping him trapped in limitation. The moment he stopped trying to fix anything and simply recognized a profound truth about his real identity, instantaneous transformation occurred. This revelation completely shattered conventional spiritual thinking that had dominated religious practice for centuries. Joel saw that most people pray to God as if God were separate from them, begging for healing as if they were disconnected from divine power. But in that hotel room, he experienced the shocking truth that the very consciousness reading these words right now is the presence and power of God itself. The problem isn't that God won't heal you or provide for you or answer your prayers. The problem is believing you're separate from God in the first place, which makes every prayer an exercise in reinforcing the very illusion that blocks demonstration. Joel's breakthrough came when he stopped trying to reach God and realized God as his own true being and essence. This shift in identity, not in circumstances, became the key to effortless manifestation and healing that would transform thousands of lives. Joel discovered that changing what you think you are automatically changes what you experience, because consciousness and its expression are one indivisible reality that cannot be separated. Joel spent the next 40 years proving this principle in the most challenging situations imaginable across every continent. Students brought him cases doctors called hopeless, financial situations that seemed completely impossible, and relationship problems that appeared beyond any possibility of repair. Yet through this one realization, breakthrough after breakthrough occurred with stunning consistency and mathematical precision. A woman with advanced cancer was told she had only days to live and should prepare for death immediately. Through Joel's teaching, she recognized her true spiritual identity beyond the physical body and experienced complete healing within just a few weeks. A businessman facing total bankruptcy applied this principle and watched his company transform into unprecedented success beyond his wildest dreams. These weren't isolated incidents or lucky coincidences, but natural results of understanding your real nature as spiritual being. The key Joel discovered is that problems exist only in the belief that you're a separate person struggling against circumstances. When you recognize yourself as divine consciousness appearing as human experience, problems dissolve because the one who seemed to have them never actually existed. This isn't philosophy or metaphysical theory, but practical mysticism with measurable results that can be verified. Joel documented case after case where this recognition produced immediate and lasting transformation in every area of human experience, proving that consciousness aligned with truth automatically demonstrates harmony. Here's the exact realization Joel experienced that night that changed everything about his understanding of spirituality. I am not a human being trying to become spiritual through effort and practice. I am spiritual being expressing as human experience right now. This shift from seeking God to recognizing yourself as God's expression changes everything instantly and permanently without exception. You stop trying to get something from God and start expressing as God's own presence and power in the world. Joel called this recognition dying daily to the personal sense of self. Every time you catch yourself believing you're separate from infinite supply, perfect health, or divine love, you simply return to the truth of your spiritual identity as God's very own consciousness and expression. The miracle isn't that circumstances change, though they often do dramatically and immediately. The miracle is that you discover the one experiencing circumstances has always been the very presence of God, never actually separate, never actually lacking, never actually in danger or threatened by any condition. This understanding becomes your permanent foundation for effortless living. Joel taught that this recognition must become as automatic as breathing, as natural as seeing, as continuous as consciousness itself. The moment you truly understand what you are, every area of your life begins reflecting that understanding through harmonious demonstration that requires no effort or struggle to maintain consistently. Let me share what happened to Margaret, one of Joel's early students who had been bedridden for 3 years with a degenerative muscle condition. Doctors offered absolutely no hope for recovery, and she had tried every spiritual method available without any success whatsoever. When Joel taught her this principle, she initially resisted because it seemed too simple to be true compared to the complex healing techniques she had been practicing. Margaret's breakthrough came during a quiet morning when she stopped trying to heal her body and simply rested in the truth of her spiritual identity beyond physical form. She wasn't Margaret with a diseased body asking God for healing. She was God's own consciousness expressing perfectly, and the body was simply reflection of that perfect spiritual reality that had never been sick or limited. Within 6 months, Margaret was not only walking perfectly, but teaching this principle to others with remarkable success. Her recovery wasn't gradual improvement over time, but a fundamental shift in her understanding of what she actually was. The body responded to this change in consciousness because matter always reflects the level of spiritual understanding we demonstrate consistently. Margaret later said that the hardest part wasn't learning the principle, but accepting that she had always been perfect spiritual being. The illness existed only in false human belief, not in her true identity as God's consciousness. Once she stopped believing in separation from perfection, perfection naturally expressed as her experience. Robert, a successful lawyer, lost everything in a market crash and faced complete financial ruin that seemed absolutely hopeless. He came to Joel's classes desperate for a miracle, but encountered something that initially frustrated him tremendously. Instead of techniques for attracting money or manifesting wealth, Joel taught him to recognize his true identity as the very source and substance of all supply and expression. Robert's transformation began when he stopped seeing himself as a person lacking money and started recognizing himself as infinite abundance appearing in human form. This wasn't positive thinking or mental manipulation, but spiritual realization based on the actual truth of being. He began making decisions from abundance consciousness rather than fear of loss or scarcity thinking. Within 18 months, Robert had not only recovered all his losses but built greater wealth than he had ever experienced before. More importantly, he never again experienced financial anxiety because he understood his true relationship to supply. He discovered that consciousness of abundance creates abundant experience, not the other way around as most people believe. Robert became one of Joel's most successful students, demonstrating that spiritual understanding translates directly into practical results in every area of human experience. He learned that when you know yourself as the source of supply rather than someone seeking supply, demonstration becomes as natural as breathing. Sarah's marriage was ending after 20 years, and she blamed her husband's betrayal for completely destroying her happiness and sense of self-worth. Through Joel's teaching, she discovered something shocking about the nature of relationships and love that revolutionized her entire understanding. She learned that trying to get love from another person was keeping her from experiencing the infinite love that was her very essence. Sarah's healing came when she stopped seeing herself as a person lacking love and started recognizing herself as love itself in expression through individual being. This wasn't about fixing her marriage or changing her husband, but about discovering the source of fulfillment that had always been present as her true nature. She began relating from wholeness rather than need or emotional dependency. Remarkably, as Sarah's consciousness of love expanded and deepened, her husband experienced his own spontaneous transformation without any effort on her part. Their marriage not only healed completely but became deeper and more fulfilling than ever before. Sarah learned that changing her understanding of herself automatically transformed every relationship because she was no longer seeking completion from others. Sarah discovered that love is not something you get from relationships, but something you are that expresses through relationships. When you know yourself as love, every person in your experience reflects that love back to you because consciousness and its reflection are one indivisible reality that cannot be separated. These stories aren't exceptional cases or rare miracles, but natural results when you understand Joel's core teaching about the nature of identity. The principle works because it's based on the actual structure of reality, not human wishful thinking or positive mental attitude. You are not a limited person trying to demonstrate unlimited good. You are unlimited good expressing as apparently limited human experience. Every healing, every demonstration, every transformation occurs through the same recognition. You are divine consciousness appearing as individual being, never separate from the infinite perfection that is your true nature. Problems exist only in false human belief, not in spiritual reality where you actually live and move and have your being as God's very own expression. If these transformation stories inspire you to discover your own spiritual identity, like this video to help others find these life-changing teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom that transforms lives, and comment sharing which healing journey resonated most deeply with your heart. Beyond the core realization, Joel taught specific practices to deepen this understanding in daily life and make it practical for ordinary human experience. The first is what he called spiritual treatment, but not the kind you might expect from traditional religious practice. This isn't asking God to change conditions, but recognizing the truth about what already exists in spiritual reality right now in this moment. When faced with any challenge, instead of trying to solve it from the human level through effort and struggle, you pause and recognize, God doesn't know this problem because God only knows perfection. Since I am God's consciousness in expression, this problem exists only in false human belief, not in my true spiritual reality where only harmony can exist. This recognition dissolves the foundation that seemed to support the problem in the first place. Joel discovered that problems persist because we acknowledge them as real and then try to overcome them through human effort. But when you recognize that infinite perfection is the only reality and you are that reality in expression, problems are revealed as false appearances that dissolve naturally. The key is consistency in this recognition, rather than intensity of effort. Joel taught that small, frequent acknowledgments of spiritual truth create more lasting transformation than occasional dramatic spiritual experiences, followed by return to human limitation thinking and problem-focused consciousness. Another powerful technique Joel taught is called dying to material sense throughout your daily experience. Throughout your day, catch yourself believing you're a material body subject to physical laws, a person with limited resources, or someone who can be hurt by external circumstances. Each time, gently return to recognizing your spiritual identity as God's consciousness in expression. This isn't denying human experience or pretending problems don't exist, but seeing them correctly from spiritual perspective. You're not a mortal being occasionally having spiritual moments during prayer or meditation. You're a spiritual being eternally expressing in what appears as human form. Your body, circumstances, and relationships are all reflection of this spiritual reality, not separate from it. Joel emphasized that this recognition must become as natural as breathing, as automatic as your heartbeat. Every thought that assumes separation from God, every fear that imagines lack or limitation, every worry that pictures yourself as vulnerable becomes an opportunity to remember and return to the truth of your divine nature expressing perfectly right now. The goal isn't to eliminate human experience, but to see it from such a high level of spiritual understanding that it harmonizes naturally without struggle. When consciousness is established in truth, truth expresses automatically through every aspect of your experience without exception. Joel also taught the practice of standing porter at the door of thought as essential spiritual discipline. Since consciousness creates experience, guarding your consciousness from false beliefs becomes the most practical activity you can engage in for transforming your life. This isn't positive thinking, but spiritual discernment based on what's actually true about God and your relationship to God. When thoughts of lack arise, you don't fight them or try to replace them, but recognize God's supply is infinite, and I am that supply and expression. When thoughts of illness appear, you acknowledge God's perfection is my true body. When thoughts of separation or conflict emerge, you remember God's love is my very being, expressing as all beings. This isn't mental manipulation or auto-suggestion, but alignment with spiritual reality that already exists. You're not trying to convince yourself of something false, but remembering what's eternally true. Joel discovered that consciousness aligned with truth automatically expresses as harmonious experience, because matter always reflects the spiritual understanding we maintain consistently. The Porter work becomes easier with practice as you develop the ability to recognize false thoughts immediately and return to truth without struggle. Eventually, this spiritual discernment becomes so natural that false beliefs have no power to disturb your peace or influence your demonstrations. The most advanced practice Joel taught is living from the secret place of the Most High continuously. This means conducting your entire life from the recognition that you are divine consciousness, appearing as human experience, not a human being occasionally connecting with divine consciousness through prayer or meditation sessions. From this perspective, every decision comes from infinite wisdom, because you recognize yourself as that wisdom in expression. Every action flows from perfect love, because you know yourself as that love appearing as individual being. Every challenge becomes an opportunity to demonstrate the truth of your spiritual identity, rather than evidence of separation from God. Joel lived this way for 40 years after his healing, and students worldwide learned to do the same with remarkable consistency. This isn't a philosophy to believe or a theory to study, but a reality to experience. The moment you truly recognize yourself as God's own consciousness and expression, your entire life becomes demonstration of that truth through effortless manifestation. This level of living requires complete surrender of the personal sense of self that believes it must figure out solutions and create harmony through human effort. You become a transparency through which divine perfection expresses, rather than a person trying to achieve spiritual demonstration through practice. Many students initially struggle with Joel's teaching because it seems to contradict everything they've learned about the spiritual path from traditional religious instruction. They've been taught to improve themselves, to overcome ego, to become worthy of God's love through good behavior and spiritual practice. But Joel's revelation points to something that dissolves all spiritual effort. You already are what you're seeking to become. The challenge isn't becoming spiritual, but recognizing the spirituality that's already your essential nature beyond all human concepts. The difficulty isn't reaching God, but acknowledging God as your very being. The problem isn't that you're separate from perfection, but that you believe in separation despite never actually experiencing it at any moment of your existence. Students often ask, if I'm already perfect spiritual being, why do I experience problems and limitations? Joel's answer was profound and revolutionary. The one experiencing problems is an illusion of thought, not your true identity. Your real being never experiences lack, illness, or separation, because your real being is wholeness, health, and unity, expressing perfectly always. This understanding eliminates the spiritual seeking that keeps you focused on what you believe you lack, rather than recognizing what you already are. The spiritual path transforms from effort to recognition, from becoming to being, from seeking God to expressing as God's consciousness in the world. Another common obstacle is fear of taking responsibility for being God's expression in human form. Students worry, if I'm divine consciousness, does that mean I created my problems and am responsible for my suffering? Joel taught that this question comes from still believing you're a person who became spiritual, rather than recognizing yourself as spiritual being appearing as person. The truth is that problems exist only in false human belief, not in your actual spiritual identity as God's consciousness. You didn't create them from your true being, and you don't need to solve them through human effort. You need only to stop believing in them by returning to the recognition of what you actually are, God's own perfect consciousness expressing as individual being. This shift eliminates guilt, fear, and the burden of trying to heal or improve yourself through spiritual practice. You discover that healing happens naturally when you stop believing there's anything that needs healing. Demonstration occurs effortlessly when you stop trying to demonstrate and simply be what you already are. Infinite perfection in expression. Joel emphasized that spiritual work isn't about changing yourself, but about recognizing what you've always been beneath all human concepts and beliefs. The moment you truly accept your divine nature, every area of your life begins reflecting that acceptance through harmonious experience. The most persistent challenge students face is what Joel called the activity of the carnal mind, or human reasoning. This is the constant mental commentary that insists you're a limited person facing real problems in a material world governed by physical laws. This voice seems so convincing because it's been your primary identity for so long that it feels completely natural and true. Joel taught that you don't fight this voice or try to overcome it through spiritual effort, but simply stop giving it authority over your experience. Every time it presents evidence of separation, lack, or limitation, you gently return to recognizing your true spiritual identity. This isn't a battle between good and evil, but a choice of which voice you're going to identify with and express from. The carnal mind gradually becomes quieter as you consistently choose to live from spiritual recognition rather than human belief and material reasoning. Eventually, it becomes just background noise that has no power to disturb your peace or influence your demonstrations. You discover the unshakable foundation of consciousness that is your actual identity beneath all mental activity. Joel warned that the carnal mind will present very convincing arguments for why spiritual truth can't be true in your particular situation. The key is learning to recognize these arguments as coming from false identity rather than spiritual wisdom, and choosing truth regardless of how convincing the material evidence appears. Students often wonder how long this transformation takes and when they can expect to see results in their experience. Joel's answer was always the same. It takes as long as it takes you to truly accept what you already are. Some experience instant breakthroughs like Joel did in that hotel room. Others require months or years of consistent practice, but every student who persists eventually experiences undeniable proof of their spiritual identity. The key is consistency rather than intensity in spiritual practice. Joel emphasized daily recognition of your true nature over dramatic spiritual experiences or peak moments. Small, consistent acknowledgments of your divine identity create more lasting transformation than occasional intense spiritual practices, followed by return to human limitation thinking. Joel taught that spiritual progress isn't measured by how often you have mystical experiences, but by how consistently you live from the recognition of your divine nature. The goal is to make spiritual consciousness your normal state, rather than something you access occasionally through prayer or meditation. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak directly to your heart and inspire transformation, like this video to support others finding these teachings, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices that change lives, and comment sharing which obstacle you're ready to transform now. Advanced students learn to live from what Joel called the fourth dimension of life, or pure spiritual consciousness. This is existence from the standpoint where matter, time, and space are recognized as mental constructs rather than governing realities. From this dimension, instantaneous healing and manifestation become natural rather than miraculous because you're operating from the level where these things originate. Joel demonstrated this repeatedly throughout his teaching career with thousands of witnesses. Students witnessed him dissolve storms through recognition of spiritual harmony, heal incurable diseases through acknowledgement of perfect spiritual embodiment, and transform desperate situations through understanding of divine order expressing in human experience without any human intervention or effort. This isn't power over matter, but recognition that matter is consciousness appearing in form, and form has no existence apart from the consciousness that appears as form. When consciousness changes through spiritual understanding, form automatically reflects that change because consciousness and its expression are one indivisible reality that cannot be separated or opposed. Living from the fourth dimension means seeing through material appearances to spiritual reality in every situation. You recognize that what appears as problem is actually opportunity for spiritual demonstration. What appears as limitation is actually invitation to recognize infinite possibility. Living from the fourth dimension means making decisions based on spiritual reality rather than material appearances or human reasoning. Joel taught students to ask in every situation, what would infinite wisdom do? What would perfect love express? How would divine order appear in this circumstance? Then trust that wisdom, love, and order to express through their consciousness without trying to figure out details. This requires releasing the belief that you must figure out solutions through human reasoning and mental effort. Instead, you rest in the recognition that divine intelligence is your very mind, and perfect solutions emerge naturally from that intelligence without mental strain or worry about outcomes. You become a transparency for divine wisdom rather than a person trying to be wise. Students discovered that this approach produces far better results than human planning, while eliminating the stress and anxiety that comes from believing you're personally responsible for creating harmony in your experience. You learn to let divine intelligence think through you rather than trying to think your way to spiritual demonstration. Joel emphasized that this isn't passivity but active cooperation with divine intelligence that knows exactly what needs to happen in every situation. Your role is to maintain spiritual consciousness and trust infinite wisdom to express perfect solutions through that consciousness. Joel's most advanced students learn to see every person and situation from the fourth dimension perspective, rather than human judgment. Instead of relating to others as material beings with human problems and limitations, they recognized everyone as divine consciousness appearing in individual form, regardless of external appearances or behavior patterns that suggested otherwise. This recognition transforms all relationships from human interaction to spiritual communion, where you're relating to the Christ presence in everyone. You stop trying to change others and start seeing the divine nature that is their true identity. Remarkably, this shift in your perception often triggers transformation in others because you're relating to their highest spiritual nature rather than their temporary human condition. Joel taught that this is the ultimate healing work, seeing spiritual perfection everywhere, acknowledging divine presence in everyone, and recognizing God's expression in every situation regardless of appearances. This isn't denial of human experience, but perception from such a high level of consciousness that human experience harmonizes naturally without effort. When you consistently see others from their spiritual identity rather than their human behavior, you become a healing presence that draws out their highest nature. This is how Jesus healed and how every spiritual master throughout history demonstrated transformation in others. The pinnacle of Joel's teaching is what he called living in the Word, or existing in such constant recognition of spiritual truth that your consciousness automatically demonstrates harmony without conscious effort. Your very presence becomes a healing influence wherever you go, because you're established in the recognition of universal perfection, expressing everywhere. Students who achieve this level don't practice spiritual principles. They embody spiritual reality as their natural state of being. They don't treat problems. They recognize the absence of problems in true spiritual existence. They don't manifest good. They express the infinite good that is their essential nature continuously and effortlessly through every thought, word, and action. Joel lived this way for the last decades of his life, and thousands of students experienced healing simply by being in his presence or reading his words. He demonstrated that when consciousness is established in spiritual truth, that truth expresses automatically through every aspect of human experience without exception. This level of spiritual living becomes possible when you completely surrender the personal sense of self that believes it must do something to create harmony. You become so transparent to divine consciousness that it flows through you naturally, blessing everyone and everything in your experience. As you approach mastery of Joel's teaching, you discover something profound about the nature of spiritual work that revolutionizes your entire approach. You realize that you've never actually been a human being learning to become spiritual through effort and practice. You've always been a spiritual being learning to express that spirituality clearly through human experience, without interference from false beliefs. This recognition eliminates the sense of spiritual seeking, because you understand that what you were seeking has always been your essential nature. There's nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, and no one to become. There's only the ongoing recognition and expression of what you eternally are, God's own perfect consciousness appearing as individual being. The spiritual path transforms from effort to recognition, from becoming to being, from seeking God to expressing as God's consciousness in the world. Every day becomes an opportunity to demonstrate more clearly the divine perfection that is your true identity, rather than an attempt to overcome human limitation through spiritual practice. Joel taught that the ultimate spiritual realization is discovering that you are the very thing you've been seeking. God isn't something outside yourself that you must reach or attain. God is your very own consciousness, and spiritual demonstration is simply letting that divine consciousness express naturally, without human interference. Joel's ultimate message was that Christ consciousness isn't something that comes to you occasionally during peak spiritual experiences, but something that you are permanently as your true identity. The consciousness reading these words right now is the same consciousness that Jesus demonstrated, that Buddha expressed, that every spiritual master throughout history recognized as their true identity. The only difference between you and the great spiritual teachers is the degree to which you recognize and express this truth consistently in daily life. They weren't special beings with unique divine connection or mystical powers. They were human beings who recognized their divine nature and lived from that recognition regardless of external circumstances or challenges. This understanding democratizes spirituality completely and eliminates spiritual hierarchy or specialness. You don't need special initiation, years of training, or exceptional spiritual gifts. You need only the willingness to recognize what you already are and to live from that recognition with increasing consistency and clarity every day. Joel proved that any person willing to accept their divine nature can demonstrate the same healing, supply, and harmony that characterized the lives of history's greatest spiritual teachers. The Christ is not a person, but consciousness, and that consciousness is equally present as every individual being. The practical result of Joel's teaching is a life of effortless harmony where problems dissolve before they fully form, where supply appears before you recognize the need, where healing occurs naturally because there's never been anything that needed healing, and your true spiritual identity is God's perfect expression. This isn't a fantasy or spiritual ideal, but the natural expression of consciousness aligned with truth about its own nature. When you know yourself as divine consciousness appearing as human experience, that consciousness automatically expresses as perfect health, abundant supply, harmonious relationships, and joyful living, because these are its natural qualities that cannot be suppressed or limited. Students worldwide continue to demonstrate this truth more than 40 years after Joel's passing, proving that his teaching points to eternal spiritual principles rather than personal charisma or temporary methods. The truth he discovered is available to every consciousness willing to recognize and accept its divine nature. Joel's legacy isn't a new religion or spiritual system, but the rediscovery of what every human being actually is beneath all concepts and beliefs about limitation. His teaching removes everything that seems to stand between you and direct experience of your divine nature. Before you give up on spirituality forever, remember Joel's profound realization in that hotel room that changed everything. You are not seeking God because you are not separate from God. You are God's own consciousness appearing as individual being, expressing perfectly in every moment, regardless of external appearances or temporary human conditions that suggest otherwise. This recognition doesn't require faith, belief, or spiritual effort to make it true. It requires only the willingness to stop believing in separation and to acknowledge what has always been true. You are divine being having a human experience, not human being occasionally connecting with divine presence through prayer or spiritual practice. The moment you truly accept this truth about yourself, every area of your life begins reflecting that acceptance through harmonious demonstration. You discover that you are the very presence and power you've been seeking, and that everything you need for perfect living is already established in consciousness as your divine inheritance. If your spiritual understanding has expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets and you're ready to live from your true identity, like this video to help others discover their divine nature. Subscribe for more transformative teachings that change lives, and comment "I am transformed" to confirm your commitment to living from spiritual truth. Most people pray desperately, begging an external God for help, never realizing they're actually pushing away the very thing they seek. Joel Goldsmith discovered a revolutionary truth that changed everything. God isn't separate from you, waiting to be convinced. The divine presence is your own consciousness when freed from human beliefs. Traditional prayer keeps you in victim consciousness, believing you lack something that must be granted from outside. But Goldsmith learned that authentic prayer isn't asking for anything. It's the recognition of what already is. When you stop begging and start recognizing, miracles become natural expressions of your true nature. This isn't positive thinking or wishful hoping. This is the mystical secret that dissolves the illusion of separation between you and infinite supply, health, and harmony. Every problem exists only in the realm of human belief, not in spiritual reality. Your consciousness, aligned with truth, is the healing presence itself. Goldsmith spent years praying the traditional way, asking God to heal his clients, to provide solutions, to change circumstances. Results were inconsistent and temporary. Then came the breakthrough that revolutionized spiritual healing. He stopped asking God to do something and started recognizing what God already is. In that moment of recognition, healings became instantaneous and permanent. Not because God finally decided to act, but because Goldsmith stopped interfering with divine action through his human concepts of lack, limitation, and separation. The healing presence was always there, waiting for recognition, not supplication. This recognition prayer isn't a technique you learn. It's a consciousness you become. When you embody this understanding, your very presence becomes a healing atmosphere. People around you experience spontaneous improvements because you're no longer projecting the belief in problems that need fixing. Here's what changes everything. God never hears your words. God responds to your consciousness. When your consciousness is filled with fear, lack, and limitation, that's what manifests regardless of how beautifully you pray. But when consciousness recognizes its own divine nature, prayer becomes unnecessary because you are the answer. Goldsmith discovered that every genuine healing happened not when he prayed harder, but when he stopped praying altogether and simply rested in the recognition of spiritual perfection. In that silence, the human sense of problems dissolved, revealing the harmony that was always present beneath the illusion. This isn't about believing in God. It's about recognizing that the I that is conscious right now is God expressing as individual being. You don't have to become spiritual. You are spiritual. You simply need to stop believing in the illusion of separation that makes prayer seem necessary in the first place. The most profound prayer Goldsmith ever prayed contained no words, made no requests, sought nothing. It was pure recognition. I and the Father are one. Not as future possibility, but as present reality. In that recognition, everything that seemed to need healing or changing simply wasn't there anymore. This recognition doesn't require faith, hope, or belief. It requires only the willingness to see through the illusion of separation that makes you think you're a human being who needs divine help. You are divine help, appearing as human experience. Problems exist only when you forget this truth. When you truly understand this, traditional prayer becomes impossible. How can you ask yourself for what you already are? Instead, you rest in being, and from that rest, perfect action emerges naturally. This is the secret that transforms every aspect of your experience from limitation to limitless expression. Sarah had prayed for her son's healing for 3 years. Traditional prayers, desperate pleading, bargaining with God. Nothing changed. Then she learned Goldsmith's approach. Instead of asking God to heal her son, she recognized that in spiritual reality, her son was already perfect, whole, and complete. Within 2 weeks of this shift in consciousness, her son's condition began improving dramatically. The doctors called it spontaneous remission, but Sarah understood the truth. She had stopped projecting the belief in disease and started recognizing the spiritual perfection that was always there. This wasn't positive thinking or denial. Sarah still took her son to medical appointments and followed treatments, but her consciousness no longer held the belief that healing needed to happen. She recognized that healing was the natural state, and illness was only a temporary appearance in human experience. Marcus lost his job and spent months praying for employment, growing more desperate with each rejection. His prayers were filled with fear, lack, and limitation. Then he discovered Goldsmith's principle. Consciousness is the substance of all form. His fearful consciousness was actually creating more experiences of lack. He stopped praying for a job and began recognizing himself as the source of infinite supply. Not through affirmations or visualizations, but through the deep understanding that consciousness, being infinite, can never actually lack anything. Lack is only a belief, not a spiritual reality. Within days, opportunities began appearing from unexpected sources, not because God finally answered his prayers, but because his consciousness was no longer broadcasting the belief in limitation. He had become receptive to the abundance that was always trying to express through him. Linda's marriage was failing. She prayed constantly for God to change her husband, to make him more loving, more understanding. The more she prayed, the worse their relationship became. Then she learned Goldsmith's revolutionary approach. You can never change another person through prayer because there is no other person. There is only one consciousness expressing as infinite individual beings. When she stopped trying to change her husband and began recognizing the divine nature expressing as both of them, their relationship transformed naturally, not through external change, but through the recognition of their spiritual unity. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting abuse. It means recognizing that harmony is the natural state of being when consciousness is aligned with truth. From this recognition, right action emerges naturally, whether that's deeper intimacy or clear boundaries. David faced bankruptcy. Traditional prayers for money had failed completely. When he learned to recognize consciousness as the source of all supply, something remarkable happened. Instead of money appearing, better opportunities emerged. His business transformed, debts restructured themselves, and abundance flowed through channels he never imagined. The key wasn't asking for money, it was recognizing that consciousness, being infinite, can never actually be bankrupt. Financial problems exist only in human belief, not in spiritual reality. When consciousness aligns with this truth, material supply follows naturally as the outer expression of inner abundance. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. What healing journey resonated most with you? Beyond recognition prayer, Goldsmith discovered the power of treatment through consciousness. This isn't visualization or mental manipulation. It's the practice of knowing the truth about any situation until that truth becomes your lived experience. When consciousness holds only spiritual reality, human appearances must conform. For physical healing, instead of fighting disease, you recognize that in spiritual reality, there is no disease. There is only perfect, harmonious being expressing as individual existence. You don't try to heal anything. You recognize that healing is unnecessary because perfection is the only reality. This recognition isn't a mental exercise. It's a shift in the very foundation of your being. When consciousness truly recognizes spiritual perfection, the body naturally expresses that perfection because consciousness is the substance from which all form emerges. The practice of spiritual discernment transforms every challenge into an opportunity for deeper recognition. When problems appear, instead of seeing them as real conditions requiring solutions, you discern between appearance and reality. The appearance may seem real, but reality is always spiritual perfection. This discernment isn't denial of human experience. You still take practical action when necessary, but your consciousness isn't fooled by appearances. You see through the illusion to the spiritual reality underneath, and from that recognition, right action emerges naturally. Every person, situation, and condition is an opportunity to practice this discernment. Each time you choose to see spiritual reality instead of human appearance, your consciousness becomes clearer, and your experience becomes more harmonious. Goldsmith taught the profound practice of meditation without desire. Most meditation seeks something: peace, healing, enlightenment. But true meditation is the complete absence of seeking. It's resting in being without wanting anything to be different than it is right now. In this meditation, you don't try to contact God or achieve any particular state. You simply rest in the recognition that what you are seeking, you already are. The peace you want is your nature. The healing you need is your reality. The enlightenment you desire is your true identity. From this rest in being, all necessary action arises naturally. You don't make decisions from human reasoning. You allow divine intelligence to express as right action through your individual experience. This is living from consciousness instead of trying to improve consciousness. The practice of invisible supply reveals how abundance operates in spiritual reality. Instead of looking to external sources for what you need, you recognize consciousness as the source of all supply. Every form of abundance is simply consciousness appearing as whatever is needed in the moment. This isn't about attracting money or material things. It's about recognizing that consciousness, being infinite, contains within itself everything necessary for harmonious expression. When you need something, instead of looking for it externally, you recognize it as already present in consciousness. This recognition often brings supply through unexpected channels. Not because you attracted it, but because consciousness naturally expresses as whatever form is needed. Supply follows recognition, not human effort or manipulation. This is how miracles become natural occurrences. Many people struggle with this approach because their human mind keeps interfering. Thoughts arise saying, "This isn't working," or "I need to do something." Goldsmith taught that these thoughts are not yours. They're the voice of human belief trying to maintain its illusion of separation and limitation. The practice is to neither fight these thoughts nor believe them. Simply recognize them as appearances in consciousness, no more real than clouds passing through the sky. Your true identity remains untouched by these temporary mental formations. When doubt arises, don't try to overcome it with positive thinking. Simply return to the recognition of what you are, consciousness itself, appearing as individual being. From this recognition, doubt naturally dissolves because it has no foundation in reality. Physical symptoms often intensify when you begin this practice, not because it's not working, but because consciousness is bringing hidden beliefs to the surface for recognition and release. This is actually a sign of deep healing, though it may not feel comfortable initially. Instead of being discouraged by temporary increases in symptoms, recognize them as beliefs leaving consciousness. Each symptom is an opportunity to practice deeper recognition of spiritual perfection. Don't fight the symptoms. Recognize through them to the reality of perfect being. This process requires patience and persistence. Years of human belief don't dissolve overnight. But each moment of recognition, regardless of how brief, establishes your consciousness more firmly in spiritual reality. Healing is happening even when appearances suggest otherwise. Relationships often become challenging when one person begins practicing recognition consciousness, while others remain in traditional human thinking. Family members may resist or misunderstand your new approach to life's challenges. The practice here is to recognize the divine nature of others, even when they're expressing human limitation. You don't try to convince them of spiritual truth. You simply hold them in consciousness as perfect spiritual beings, regardless of their current expression. This often leads to natural harmony without any external discussion or conflict. When your consciousness recognizes only spiritual perfection in others, they tend to express more of their divine nature in your presence. Change happens through consciousness, not through human persuasion. Financial challenges persist for some because they're trying to use spiritual principles to get material results, which keeps them trapped in human consciousness. True spiritual supply isn't about getting money. It's about recognizing consciousness as the source of all form, including material abundance. When you need something, instead of worrying about where it will come from or how you'll afford it, rest in the recognition that consciousness already contains everything necessary for harmonious expression. Supply appears through whatever channel is most natural and beneficial. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment, which obstacle are you ready to transform now? Advanced practitioners learn to live from recognition consciousness throughout daily activities. Instead of moving through your day as a human being trying to be spiritual, you recognize yourself as spiritual being appearing as human experience. Every activity becomes an expression of divine consciousness. This transforms work from mere employment into divine service. Relationships become opportunities for consciousness to recognize itself. Even mundane tasks become expressions of infinite intelligence appearing as individual action. Nothing is separate from the divine expression of being. This isn't about thinking spiritual thoughts while doing human activities. It's about recognizing that what you call you is actually consciousness itself, appearing as individual expression. From this recognition, all activity becomes harmonious because it's sourced in divine intelligence. Healing others becomes effortless when you understand that there is no other to heal. There is only one consciousness expressing as infinite individual beings. When someone appears to need healing, you recognize the spiritual perfection of your shared being, and that recognition is the healing. You don't send healing energy or pray for their improvement. You simply rest in the recognition that in spiritual reality, they are already perfect, whole, and complete. This recognition in your consciousness appears as healing in their experience because consciousness is indivisible. This approach works regardless of physical proximity. Distance is only a concept in human belief, not a reality in consciousness. When consciousness recognizes spiritual perfection, that recognition expresses as healing wherever it's needed, because consciousness is everywhere present. Business and career transform when conducted from recognition consciousness instead of human ambition. Instead of trying to succeed or avoid failure, you recognize consciousness as the intelligence expressing through all genuine activity. Success becomes the natural expression of divine intelligence. This doesn't mean becoming passive or avoiding practical action. It means taking action from recognition rather than from fear or desire. When consciousness recognizes its own infinite intelligence, right action emerges naturally, leading to harmonious results. Competition disappears because you recognize consciousness as the source of all genuine activity. What benefits one expression of consciousness benefits all. Cooperation becomes natural because you recognize your essential unity with everyone and everything in your business environment. Parenting from recognition consciousness transforms both you and your children. Instead of trying to control or improve their behavior, you recognize their spiritual perfection. This recognition creates an atmosphere where their divine nature naturally expresses more consistently. You still provide guidance and maintain appropriate boundaries, but from recognition rather than fear. Your consciousness, resting in spiritual truth about your children, becomes the healing influence that supports their natural development and expression of divine qualities. This approach often produces remarkable changes in children's behavior and development, not through external manipulation, but through the recognition of their true nature. Children are naturally responsive to consciousness that recognizes their divine identity. Complete transformation occurs when recognition becomes your natural state, rather than a practice you do. You no longer shift from human consciousness to spiritual consciousness. You simply rest in the recognition of what you've always been, consciousness itself. From this recognition, life becomes effortless. Not because challenges disappear, but because consciousness meets every appearance with appropriate action sourced in divine intelligence. You don't overcome problems. You recognize through them to the spiritual reality that dissolves them. This is not a perfect human life. It's the recognition that perfect spiritual being is expressing as human experience. Every moment becomes an opportunity for deeper recognition and more harmonious expression of divine consciousness. The ultimate realization is that there was never anything wrong that needed fixing, no one separate who needed healing, nothing missing that required supply. These were all appearances in consciousness, like dreams that seem real until awakening reveals their illusory nature. You don't become spiritual through this practice. You recognize the spiritual nature that you've always been. Problems don't get solved. They're revealed as having no foundation in reality. Healing doesn't happen. The illusion of disease is seen through to the spiritual perfection that was never actually disturbed. This recognition doesn't make you indifferent to human experience. Instead, it makes you infinitely compassionate because you see through all appearances of limitation to the divine nature that is everyone's true identity. Living this understanding daily requires no effort because it's not something you do. It's the recognition of what is. Every person you meet is consciousness recognizing itself. Every situation is consciousness expressing as experience. Every challenge is an invitation to deeper recognition. Prayer becomes unnecessary because you are the answer to every prayer. Seeking ends because what you sought, you are. Healing is recognized as the natural state, and disease as temporary appearance. Supply is recognized as consciousness itself, and lack as impossible illusion. This doesn't make you superhuman. It reveals your true nature as spiritual being expressing in human form. From this recognition, miraculous becomes natural, and natural becomes expression of infinite divine intelligence appearing as your individual experience. Joel Goldsmith's ultimate teaching is beautifully simple. You are not a human being having spiritual experiences. You are a spiritual being having human experiences. This recognition transforms everything while changing nothing, because what you are seeking, You already are. Stop praying to God and recognize yourself as the divine presence you were seeking. Stop asking for healing and recognize yourself as wholeness itself. Stop looking for supply and recognize consciousness as infinite abundance expressing as your experience. This is not the end of your journey. It's the beginning of living from your true identity. Every moment offers the opportunity to recognize more deeply what you are and to express more fully the divine consciousness that is your real nature. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path.
My friends, as we gather together in this moment of quiet, let us lay aside all the noise that fills the world, the arguments, the debates, the fears, and the many opinions that claim to speak for truth. In recent times, you may have noticed a great deal being said about something called Christ consciousness. Some voices declare that it is the highest truth mankind can know. Others insist that it is deception, an error, perhaps even an attempt to replace God with human imagination. And so the world begins once again to divide itself, not over truth, but over the words that attempt to point toward truth. But here, in the atmosphere of spiritual contemplation, let us come to a different realization. We are not gathered to defend a phrase, nor to fight for a concept, nor to correct the opinions of the world. We are here for one sacred purpose: to touch, to feel, and to know the living presence that Jesus revealed and that every mystic throughout the ages has experienced within the silent depths of their own being. When Jesus spoke of the Christ, he did not speak of a theory. He spoke of a presence. He spoke of a light. He spoke of a spiritual identity that does not belong to one man alone, but that expresses itself as the life of every individual who turns inward and recognizes the source of their being. You see, the moment we become entangled in arguments about names and definitions, we lose sight of the very presence those words were meant to reveal. Some say this teaching is false, and others say this teaching is new. But truth is neither false nor new. Truth is, the Christ is not a movement, a trend, or a doctrine. It is the eternal nature of God expressed. And whether we use the phrase Christ consciousness or never utter those words once in our lifetime, the truth itself does not change. It is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And it exists not as an idea in the mind, but as a living reality in the depth of spiritual awareness. So let us begin here, not with controversy, not with reaction, but with recognition. Let us open ourselves to the possibility that behind every argument about Christ, behind the fears and the claims and the counterclaims, there is a presence, silent, infinite, indivisible, waiting to be acknowledged. And as we proceed together, I ask you to do only this. Do not listen with the mind that seeks to agree or disagree. Listen with that deeper sense within you, which knows truth by its own light. For what we explore today is not a concept to be debated, but a reality to be realized. And in that realization, all fear dissolves, all confusion is quieted, and only the one remains. Now let us go a little deeper, and let us do so gently, without haste. For when we approach spiritual truth with hurry, we approach it with the mind, and the mind can only interpret what it already knows. Spiritual truth must be received in stillness, in openness, in that inner listening where the presence itself imparts its own meaning. The great misunderstanding surrounding what is called Christ consciousness arises from this very point. Men try to understand spiritual reality with the human mind, and the human mind being finite, can only seize upon words, not the essence to which the words point. So one person hears the word Christ and immediately thinks of theology. Another hears the word consciousness and thinks of psychology or philosophy. And between these two interpretations, the living spirit is lost. But you see, words are never truth. Words are symbols. They are shadows of something far greater than any language can carry. And the moment we bind ourselves to a word, the moment we say, this is what the Christ means, or this is what consciousness means, we have replaced revelation with definition. We have chosen the letter over the spirit. You remember Paul's profound statement, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. Why does the letter kill? Because the letter becomes a barrier to the inner realization. Once the mind believes it knows truth, it stops seeking truth. But when the heart is open, when it says, Father, reveal thyself, then the living activity of spirit begins its work, and understanding flows without effort. The misunderstanding, then, does not lie in the phrase Christ consciousness. The misunderstanding lies in the approach, in the attempt to grasp that which is infinite with that which is limited. When we approach this teaching with the mind, we argue. When we approach it with the spirit, we behold. And this is what I would have you see. It is not the word Christ that brings confusion. It is not the word consciousness. It is the absence of inner realization behind the word. When two people use the same term but speak from different levels of awareness, one from intellect, one from spirit, they will never agree, not because one is right and the other is wrong, but because they are speaking from different states of being. Truth is known only in the state of consciousness that can receive it. So let us not react to words. Let us not fear them, nor cling to them, nor make them sacred. Instead, let us turn inward and ask, what is the reality behind this expression? What is the spirit trying to reveal? For when the spirit reveals itself, the word becomes transparent, and only the presence remains. And when the presence is known, all debate ends, not by victory, but by dissolution. As we move forward, let us look with compassion upon the fears that arise whenever spiritual truth begins to break through the crust of human belief. It is natural that when the light appears, the shadows seem to lengthen. But remember this, the shadow has no substance of its own. It is merely the appearance created when the mind turns away from the light of its own being. Many sincere individuals fear the phrase Christ consciousness because they believe it seeks to replace God with man, or to elevate the human ego to some divine status. Others fear it because they think it diminishes the uniqueness of Jesus, or that it invites deception, or that it opens the door to pride and spiritual confusion. And let us not dismiss these fears. They arise from deep devotion, deep longing, deep sincerity. But sincerity without spiritual discernment always produces anxiety because it clings to form rather than essence. Let us then look at these fears for what they are, not signs of truth, but signs of separation. Fear always has one root, the belief that we stand apart from God, that we must protect ourselves from error, from illusion, from darkness. Yet how can that be so if God truly is the light of our being? How can the presence that formed us, that sustains us, that lives its own life as our life, how can that presence ever be threatened by an idea or a phrase? You see, spiritual fear is nothing more than the mind attempting to guard its own boundaries. It hears a term it cannot understand, and immediately it contracts. But truth is never known through contraction. Truth is known through openness. It is known in the stillness where the Spirit itself whispers, "Fear not, it is I." If a teaching is false, the Spirit within us reveals its falsity not through fear, but through quiet clarity. And if a teaching is true, the Spirit reveals its truth not through excitement or emotion, but through inner peace. Fear plays no part in the activity of God. So when someone hears the phrase Christ consciousness and feels fear, the fear does not come from the presence. The fear comes from the belief that Christ is something external, something fragile, something that can be distorted by human thought. But Christ is not fragile. Christ is not dependent upon our understanding or our protection. Christ is the living expression of God, the I am that never leaves us nor forsakes us. Let us then release these fears, not by argument, not by force, but by recognizing that the Christ can never be threatened by the human mind. The human mind cannot add to it, nor can it take away from it. The Christ stands as pure spiritual identity, untouched by human interpretation. When you rest in this realization, fear dissolves, not because the outer world becomes safer, but because you discover that your safety never depended upon the world at all. It depended upon the presence, and that presence is your very being. Now, before we enter the true understanding of this subject, it is necessary to clear away the misconceptions that have gathered around it. For if we attempt to build upon a foundation of confusion, the structure will not stand. So let us take a moment to look directly at what the world calls Christ consciousness, and to understand not what it is, but what it is not. Only then can the true nature of the Christ be revealed in its purity. First, Christ consciousness is not the human ego declaring itself divine. The personal I, with all its desires, fears, ambitions, and insecurities, is never the Christ. The Christ does not arise from human will, nor is it something a person can attain by discipline, effort, or self-affirmation. The moment the personal self tries to claim divinity, it creates the very deception so many people fear. For the human self has no capacity to be divine. It has no life of its own. It is but a shadow, a temporary appearance upon the screen of consciousness. Second, Christ consciousness is not self-improvement. It is not a newer, stronger, wiser version of the human mind. It is not a mystical upgrade to the personality. The Christ does not perfect the human being. It reveals the truth that the human being was never the center of existence to begin with. You cannot polish the shell and call it the pearl. The pearl is within. Third, Christ consciousness is not a technique for power or manifestation. It offers no magical abilities, no psychic gifts, no tools to manipulate the world of form. The Christ is the absence of manipulation. It is the recognition that God alone is the activity, the substance, and the law of all that appears. When you seek the Christ for power, you lose it. When you seek the Christ for truth, power is unnecessary. Fourth, Christ consciousness is not a replacement for Jesus, nor a denial of his role. Jesus was the clearest expression of Christ the world has known. But even he said, "Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one." He pointed always beyond the personal self to the Father within. To recognize Christ consciousness is not to diminish Jesus, it is to honor him by understanding the reality he embodied. Fifth, Christ consciousness is not an elite attainment reserved for a few mystics or spiritual prodigies. It is not the property of a special class of enlightened individuals. It is the birthright of every soul, for it is the reality of every soul. What makes it seem rare is not its nature, but our forgetfulness. The Christ stands at the door of consciousness in every person, but few open the door. Sixth, Christ consciousness is not a religion. It cannot be institutionalized, cannot be packaged into creeds, cannot be owned by any church or movement. It does not require adherence to any tradition. The Christ is the inner activity of God revealing itself to individual consciousness, and it transcends every boundary created by human thought. And seventh, Christ consciousness is not something new. Truth never comes into existence. Truth simply becomes recognized. The Christ existed before Abraham was, before any scripture was written, before any doctrine was formed. It is the eternal presence that has always been and that forever will be. When these misunderstandings are removed, when we see what Christ's consciousness is not, then a great stillness begins to form in us. The mind ceases grasping, the emotions cease reacting, and into that stillness, the true revelation of the Christ can enter. For now, let us simply rest in this clarity. The Christ is not an achievement, not a belief, not a human claim. It is the nature of God expressing as your very self. And now, having cleared the ground of misunderstanding, we can begin to approach the truth, not the truth as theory, nor the truth as belief, but the truth as direct revelation. For Christ is not something that can be explained adequately with words. It can only be known in the moment it reveals itself within your consciousness. But words may point the way, and so we use them gently, reverently, knowing they are only the finger pointing toward the moon, not the moon itself. What, then, did we mean when we used the word Christ? And what did Jesus mean when he spoke of the Christ? And what did every mystic throughout the ages feel when they touched that inner light that dissolves the barriers of fear and separation? Joel Goldsmith taught that the Christ is the spiritual identity of every individual, the divine essence that stands behind the appearance of personhood. It is not the body you see in the mirror. It is not the personality that changes with circumstance and mood. It is not your memories, your temperament, your beliefs, your talents, or your struggles. These are but garments worn for a moment in time. Christ is the I am that existed before any of these garments appeared. When Moses heard the voice say, "I am that I am," it was not a personal being speaking from a bush. It was the Christ announcing itself, the eternal presence, declaring its own nature. When Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," he was not speaking of the man Jesus. He was speaking of the Christ appearing as Jesus. And when he said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he was not excluding mankind. He was revealing what mankind truly is beneath the veil of personal identity. For the Christ is not a person. The Christ is a presence. The Christ is not limited to one time or place. The Christ is eternal. The Christ is not an exclusive possession. The Christ is universal. The Christ is the activity of God made visible as individual being. Goldsmith would often say that Christ is God individualized, not God divided, not God fragmented, not God parceled out, but God expressing itself as infinite forms of one life, one being, one consciousness. When you look upon a person, any person, regardless of appearance, you are beholding a form in which the Christ abides, whether recognized or not. When you look upon yourself, what you call me is only the surface. Beneath that surface, closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, shines the same Christ. This is why the Christ cannot be owned by any religion. It cannot be confined to a creed or a temple. It cannot be imprisoned in dogma or tradition. The Christ is the light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. And if it lighteth every man, then it also lights you. Not one day, not after long purification, not as a reward for righteousness, now, in this moment, as your own being. But the mind does not recognize it. The senses do not perceive it. The personal I does not understand it. Only the spirit within you knows its own nature. And when the personal self grows quiet enough to let that inner knowing rise, then you begin to feel something, a quiet joy, a gentle peace, an unexplainable certainty, not about doctrine, not about belief, but about being itself. This is the Christ, not a doctrine, not a controversy, not a movement, not an achievement, a living presence, the true I of every individual. And when this dawns upon you, you will find that you no longer ask, what is Christ consciousness? Nor do you fear the term, for you will know, without words, that the Christ is the light within you, the life that animates you, the presence that lives you. And once that is seen, the world cannot take it from you. And now, let us look closely at the cause of all confusion, all distortion, all spiritual struggle. For every misunderstanding that arises around the word Christ, and every argument that forms around the idea of consciousness, can be traced to one simple error. The personal sense of self attempts to grasp what belongs only to spiritual awareness. The personal self, this I that we have believed ourselves to be, is a bundle of past experiences, memories, beliefs, desires, fears, and opinions. It is not evil, nor is it to be condemned, but it is limited, it is finite, and because it is limited, it cannot receive the infinite. It cannot understand the presence that transcends all boundaries. It cannot hold within itself the truth that has no shape, no form, no beginning, and no end. And yet this personal sense tries. It hears the word Christ and attempts to define it through the intellect. It hears the word consciousness and attempts to analyze it. It tries to capture the infinite with a net of finite understanding, and in doing so, it becomes frustrated, afraid, or proud. This is the source of every spiritual misstep. The human mind tries to be the instrument of divine revelation, but the human mind is not that instrument. It was never designed to be. It can memorize scripture, it can repeat doctrine, it can argue theology, it can organize religion, but it cannot receive spiritual truth. It cannot behold God. Only the Spirit within you can behold the Spirit that is God. Joel Goldsmith often said, the human mind is not the avenue of spiritual wisdom, and this must be understood deeply, for the moment we attempt to understand God intellectually, we create a concept of God, and a concept is not God. A concept is an image formed from the materials of the mind, memory, imagination, logic, emotion. These are shadows of truth, not truth itself. So the great error is not in using the phrase Christ consciousness. The great error is in the place from which we try to understand it. If we approach it with the mind, we create confusion. If we approach it with fear, we create resistance. If we approach it with desire, we create fantasy. But when we approach it in stillness, with no desire to grasp or to claim or to become, then the Spirit itself reveals what the mind could never contain. Let us be clear. The personal I cannot awaken. The personal I cannot become divine. The personal I cannot attain Christ consciousness. It is not the human who becomes the Christ. It is the Christhood that reveals the unreality of the human. When we believe that our human self can rise into divinity, we fall into illusion. But when the human self becomes still, silent, surrendered, when it ceases striving, ceases claiming, ceases seeking, then something miraculous begins to take place. Not as an effort, but as grace. The Christ within begins to reveal itself, not as a doctrine, not as a mystical experience, but as the simple, direct awareness of being. You may notice this in moments of profound peace, when the mind rests and something deeper shines forth, or in moments when fear dissolves for no reason, or when love wells up without an object, or when life seems to flow through you without your guiding it. These are glimpses not of a human becoming divine, but of the divine revealing itself as your true nature. Therefore, the great error is not that people speak of Christ consciousness. The great error is believing that the personal self is the center of spiritual life. But when this personal sense grows quiet, when it steps aside and stops trying to understand, then the infinite becomes visible. The Christ stands revealed not as something achieved, but as something eternally present. And in that moment, without language, without concept, without argument, that the Christ was never missing, never distant, never waiting for you to reach. It has always been the I that lives itself as you. Let us now come to the turning point of the spiritual life, the moment of recognition. For all the teachings, all the scriptures, all the meditation in the world are but preparation for this one simple shift, the shift from identifying yourself as a person to recognizing yourself as presence. This recognition does not come through effort. It does not come through study. It does not come because you try to understand God or try to become spiritual. It comes the moment you begin to question the identity you have assumed since childhood. It begins when you pause and ask, very quietly, who is the I that is aware right now? You may think you know the answer. You may say, I am this body, or I am this personality, or I am this mind, these emotions, these memories. But if you look just a little deeper, you will notice something remarkable. Everything you can describe about yourself is something you observe. The body appears and ages. The mind thinks and stops thinking. Emotions rise and fall. Memory fades and returns. But the one who observes all these changes does not change. That observer, silent, invisible, unchanging, is the Christ within you. When you say, I think, who is the I that notices the thought? When you say, I feel, who is the I that is aware of the feeling? When you say, I fear, who is the I that witnesses the fear arise and dissolve? And when you sit in stillness, and there is no thought, no feeling, no movement, what remains? That which remains is the presence, and that presence is the Christ. The personal self cannot make this recognition. It cannot force it, cannot will it, cannot reason its way into it. The personal self is dissolved by it. But the moment you become still enough to notice that every thought about I is not the real I, the moment the false identification slips away, there is a gentle, effortless realization. I am not this limited sense of self. I am the presence that beholds it. This is not imagination. It is not affirmation. It is not a mantra. It is pure recognition. And with that recognition comes a quiet shift. You begin to understand that the problems you believed were yours belong only to the personal sense of self, the self you are no longer identifying with. The fear, the lack, the guilt, the striving, all of these belong to the false I. They were never the burden of your true self. As you rest in this newfound awareness, even for a moment, something profound begins to occur. The grip of personal identity loosens. The urgency of human living softens. A peace that does not depend upon circumstances rises from within, and you discover that the I you thought you were, the anxious, striving, fearing self, was never you at all. It was a dream image, a shadow cast upon the surface of consciousness. But the true I, the Christ I am, is the light behind the shadow. Once this is glimpsed, even faintly, life begins to unfold differently. You no longer move from fear but from presence. You no longer seek God as something outside of you, because you feel God as the very essence of your being. You no longer strive to fix the world, because you realize that the world that needs fixing is the world seen through the lens of personal sense. When that lens falls away, what remains is harmony, not created by you, but revealed to you. This recognition is the beginning of spiritual life. Everything before it is preparation. Everything after it is deepening. But the recognition itself, the moment you shift from person to presence, is the moment the Christ stands revealed within your own consciousness. It is the moment you awaken to what has always been true. For the Christ does not come to you. The Christ is uncovered in you. It does not descend from above. It emerges from within. It does not require your belief. It requires your surrender. When this dawns upon you not as an idea, but as experience, you know that the truth Jesus lived, the truth the mystics realized, the truth Goldsmith taught, is nothing less than the truth of your own being. Once this recognition begins to dawn, once you have even the faintest awareness that the true I of your being is not the personal self, but the infinite presence, you will notice that life starts to unfold in a new and quieter rhythm, not because you have tried to change your outer circumstances, but because something within has shifted. You are no longer living from the sense of me trying to live life. Life begins to live itself as you. This is what we mean when we say living the Christ identity. It is not a new behavior. It is not a new role you play. It is not a spiritual persona you create. It is the natural fruit that appears the moment the inner tree is recognized. The Christ is the root. Harmony is the fruit. The Christ is the light. Peace is its reflection. The Christ is the presence. Healing is its evidence. And these fruits appear without effort, without strain, without the pressure to achieve. Let us look gently at the ways this manifests. First, when you live from the Christ identity, fear begins to dissolve. Not because you work at eliminating fear, but because you no longer identify with the self that can be threatened. Fear belongs to the personal sense of life. The Christ knows nothing of it. So as you rest in the I am, fear loses its power. It has no foothold, for it no longer finds an identity in you through which to operate. Second, you discover that supply flows more naturally. You cease to look to people, jobs, circumstances, or outer channels as your source. You begin to feel deeply, quietly, that I am is supply. Not that supply comes to you, but that supply lives as you. When this is realized, the anxiety around money, opportunity, and provision gently loosens. You take whatever actions are necessary, but you are no longer driven by fear, and therefore your actions are guided rather than forced. Third, healing begins to arise without effort. This does not mean the body must always be perfect according to human standards. It means the sense of being a body with a problem softens. You recognize that the I which you are is untouched by disease, untouched by age, untouched by the conditions of matter. And as that realization deepens, many physical struggles simply dissolve in the light of truth, not because you have attempted to heal them, but because you have ceased to identify with the self that suffers from them. Fourth, relationships transform. When you recognize the Christ as your identity, you begin to recognize it as the identity of every individual regardless of their behavior. You no longer react to the mask others wear. You see behind the mask to the presence that stands there silently. This does not mean you accept harmful behavior or become passive. It means your responses become rooted in clarity, not in fear or judgment. Love arises naturally, not sentimental love, but the love that sees truth in spite of appearances. Fifth, judgment fades. Judgment is the activity of the personal self comparing one image with another. The Christ does not judge because the Christ sees only itself. As this vision opens within you, the harshness you once had toward yourself softens. The harshness you once had toward others dissolves. You begin to live in a quiet freedom, free of condemnation, free of self-attack, free of resentment. Sixth, inner peace becomes the atmosphere of your life. Not a peace that is created by silence or meditation, but a peace that flows from the realization that your being is sustained by the presence, not by human effort. When you stop trying to manage life, life manages itself. When you stop trying to understand the plan, you see the plan unfolding moment by moment as grace. And seventh, the need to argue, to defend, to explain, disappears. For when the Christ is recognized, truth becomes self-evident. You no longer feel compelled to convince anyone. You no longer feel threatened by differing views. You live in a sense of inner freedom, knowing that truth is not something that needs your protection. Truth protects itself by its very nature. This, then, is living from the Christ identity, not a new behavior or a new belief, but the quiet unfolding of life as it is meant to be lived. The Christ within you is not waiting for you to become spiritual. It is waiting for you to become still, that it may reveal itself. No human being can live the Christ life, but the Christ can live its life as you the moment you cease striving and begin resting in the truth of your being. And now, as we come to the close of our time together, let us enter the deepest and most essential truth of all, that the Christ cannot be understood through speech, nor fully conveyed through teaching, nor captured by any phrase, whether praised or criticized. All that we have said here, all that has been offered in gentle explanation, is but the preparation for something infinitely more real than words. For spiritual truth is never contained in the mind. It is revealed only in the stillness of your own being. You may notice that throughout our exploration, something in you has grown quieter. Something has softened. Something has become more spacious. That is not due to the words themselves. It is due to the activity of the presence within you, responding to the recognition of its own nature. For the Christ does not lie in the future. It does not lie in intellectual understanding. It does not lie in the mastery of spiritual concepts. The Christ is the eye of you, the very light of your consciousness, awaiting nothing but your willingness to be still. If you were to forget every word spoken here and remember only this, it would be enough. The Christ is the true identity of your being. It cannot be threatened, cannot be argued, cannot be diminished, and cannot be lost. Whether the world accepts this or rejects it, whether language confuses it or clarifies it, whether beliefs support it or contradict it, none of these change the truth. The truth stands silently, eternally, as the foundation of your existence. So do not concern yourself with the questions that trouble the world. Is Christ consciousness true? Is it false? Is it a danger? Is it a deception? These questions arise only when we are still identified with the personal mind. When the Christ within you is recognized, the questions dissolve of themselves, not because you have found the correct answers, but because you have discovered that the questioner was never the real you. From this moment on, I invite you to practice only one thing. Whenever you find yourself confused, fearful, defensive, or uncertain, pause just for a breath and gently ask, who is the I experiencing this? And as you sit with that question, without hurry, without strain, without searching for an answer, you will begin to feel a subtle shift. The personal I, with all its burdens, begins to recede, and the true I, the Christ, begins to reveal itself as peace, as clarity, as presence. This revelation does not need your belief. It does not need your effort. It does not need your perfection. It needs only your willingness to be still. So we leave this teaching not with more knowledge, but with a deeper silence, not with certainty of words, but with certainty of presence. Not with an idea of Christ, but with the living Christ shining quietly as your very self. Let us rest, then, in that which is eternal. Let us rest in the I am that was before all thought. Let us rest in the presence that needs no defense and offers no argument. And as we rest, let us allow the Christ to reveal itself in its own way, in its own time, as your own being. And in that revelation, all doubts end, all fears dissolve, and only the one remains.